Hello, and welcome to our East Coast road trip. I'm going to take you with me on a little journey, so I thank you for joining me. We are going to leave our home here in the KZN Midlands, KwaZulu-Natal of South Africa, and head down our driveway. It's not really our driveway, you could call it the road to our home, but considering we're the only house at the top of the hill, well, not actually, we do have a neighbour. There's two houses on the top of the hill, the one that doesn't live there, but we live permanently at the top of the hill. And here we are going down the hill because we are heading out on a tour, a road trip. And there in front of us is the lake, one of the lakes. In fact, there are a few lakes on this private nature reserve where we live, but I want you to notice specifically that willow tree because my mother planted that willow tree and it is growing very nicely in that little spot. But this is one of the lakes that we will drive past. And this is just to give you a feel of the beginnings of our East Coast road trip. We're going to go from here, from our home, into Howick, which is our nearest town. And I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. And then we will head from there down to Maclear, and then from Maclear down to Graaff-Reinet, and off to George and Port Elizabeth, and then head back home again. So if you want to follow that route on the map, or if you want to get your children to see whereabouts we're going, if they would be interested in watching this, that would be great. But in the meantime, what I'm doing is I'm just taking you on a little drive out, exiting from our home, which is this private nature reserve. And as you can tell, it's gravel all the way, which we don't mind because it gets us to drive slowly and we also get to spot some wildlife. See that blesbuck over there on the side. Okay, back to the road. Here we're going up the hill with the London plane trees on our right. And this is just how it looks. This is the views that we have on our way out of our property. Pretty spectacular. We feel very privileged and very blessed. So I'm really glad I can share a few moments of it with you. And now we're going to be approaching our gate, one of our gates. Gates is a big matter in our lives because we're always having to go through gates. And so what we've done is we've decided to turn them into prayer gates so that every time we've got to stop and open and close a gate, we use it as an opportunity to pray for somebody, whoever it is that the Lord lays on our heart. So here is our first gate, which means it's time to open it and think of somebody who we need to pray for that person, drive through, close the gate, and all that time we can just be spending in prayer. And so they've become quite a privilege now to have all these gates to go through. And now here we are on what we call the main road to Howick. This is still just gravel and doesn't look much like a main road. The bakkie passing us is going to put a lot of dust in my way. And in actual fact, I'm going to tell you a little story about this. Because here in the country, we have this unspoken rule whereby we try not to pass people on the gravel because we know a few things could happen. One, we could just be swallowed up in a lot of dust. And another one is that we're probably going to get stuck behind a logging truck soon thereafter because the gravel roads are very, very dangerous. And speaking of logging trucks, actually, you'll see just ahead here a log, which shows us that it has probably fallen off a truck. So it's very probable that we're going to come across a logging truck on this road. So you might have noticed that we were on the gravel and now we are on the tar. We do 6 k's of gravel road before we get onto the tar, and then there's another about 20 k's on tar road before we arrive at the town, the nearest town to us, which is Howick. So I'm just showing you a little bit of the scenery on the left and the right as we go along, travelling down this Graaff-Reinet road, it is called, because we live in the KZN Midlands. So it's very much like this all the way. Lots of trees and farmlands and open pastures. So the part of the country where we live can be described as farmland and forestry. And there we have our logging truck, you see. So now we have to really slow down, drive very, very carefully behind this logging truck. You saw that one of the logs is lying on the side of the road that we have passed earlier. So now we're going to have to pass this logging truck very, very carefully because you never know if a log is going to escape from its bounds and come tumbling down onto the road. And off we go again on this Graaff-Reinet road. There we go. There's a whole lot of forestry area that you can see on either side, big plantations. And I'm just wanting to share with you the general countryside in this area. You'll see it's just very, very pretty. It's a lovely, lovely drive into our nearest town, being Howick. And Howick is our little village, which we're going to be driving through shortly. But here we have another heavy vehicle passing us. As you can see, there's a lot of that happening on our way into town. It's not uncommon. That row of trees you see there on the left, oh, I love that row of trees, especially in the autumn. Every tree is like a different shade. It's beautiful. And we very often see the cows out in the fields grazing. That's also not an uncommon sight. And here we are, arriving in Howick after our 20 kilometers on tar. And you'll see on the left a lot of green roofs. This is the ambers. Ambers is well known in the area because there's a lot of different kinds of ambers. Amber Glen, Amber Field. And this is a place, a retirement village actually. In fact, Howick is known as the mecca of retirement village developments in the country. And because there are just so many of them. We have found that it's actually been an opportunity for our characters to grow because when we come into town, the town is full of a lot of elderly people, and it's really just very, very precious and a wonderful atmosphere. And we do feel blessed by it, and we feel we have grown by living in a town that has lots of retirement villages in it. And there we are, look at that. We're in Howick now. It is official. So here we go, into the little town of Howick, which is actually growing very fast. In fact, there's a new development that I'm going to show you now. It is called Yard 41. It's particularly quaint, this development. It's got an architectural style that I think is very different, and it really is fitting in this town. In fact, on the other side of the buildings, across into the horizon there, you'll see a bit of a gorge. You probably can't see it too well, but I'm going to take you and show you the Howick Falls now, because we're very proud of our Howick Falls. They are very, very beautiful. We're almost there. It's really worth seeing this. Hope you can come and see it for real one day. But here we have the Howick Falls. Aren't they spectacular? I mean, obviously this video can't possibly do it justice, but we're going to do our best to show you. Them cascading down the rock, the water cascading down the rock, into the river below. We've brought quite a few guests here, international guests that come to visit us here in South Africa. We bring them and show them the Howick Falls because we think it's just so, so stunningly beautiful. That's the gorge there that I was talking about, where Yard 41 overlooks this gorge. This might give you a better visual of the gorge I was referring to. And you'll see that at the top of the falls, well, you might just be able to make it out, is some of the locals right there at the top doing some washing in the river. And another thing that the locals do is they do a lot of artisan crafts. Isn't it amazing? I'm just so impressed with these people. This is all handmade from seeds and beads and wire and whatever they can find, really. It's quite amazing. They're very industrious. And look at that South African flag there. I know I'm standing over it, shadowing it, but they've done that with beads. That's a little basket, a little dish that they've made. And this is fascinating. This is a bangle that they have made with safety pins, and joined a whole lot of safety pins together on some elastic and put beads down the shafts on either side of the safety pin. It's very, very attractive. And I had to get this shot for you because look at this. This is a little daisy or little yellow flower. I don't actually know its proper name, botanical name, managing to grow there between the rocks. I thought that was very pretty. I couldn't resist. So here we are now leaving Howick. We had a little stop at the falls and looked at some of what the locals are making with their hands and being such industrious people. And now we leave the town, and this is just the main street of Howick. So you get an idea of what it looks like in Howick. And here is the hospital, the Howick Hospital. This is a very important building because, in fact, when we moved into the country because of our daughter having a severe medical condition. And the pediatrician said that just move out of town as far as you can so as to try and support her health. So we moved to the country and there wasn't a hospital nearby. So we began to pray. And did we pray? We asked the Lord to please provide us with a hospital. It was a big ask, I know, but we prayed. And then they started building Howick Hospital. It was the first hospital in Howick. So it was very exciting to us. In fact, Missy was the first patient in this hospital. So I won't go into all the details of why Missy needed to go to hospital, but the short story is that she needed to go and have immune replacement therapy. So she had to go into hospital to have polygam infusions, and that had to be done in the environment of a hospital. So before Howick Hospital was built, we used to have to drive down to the next hospital, which was an hour and a half further on down the road. So we were very, very blessed when Howick Hospital was built, because now it was 30 minutes away from our home, which meant we could, it just made it more convenient for us to be able to come in to town, and Missy could go to Howick Hospital. And with her being the first patient there, they gave her a little certificate. I mean, what a strange certificate to get. But anyway, she got a certificate for being the first patient at Howick Hospital. So that's the story about Howick Hospital. And now we're back on the road, heading towards our first stopover, which will be in Maclear. And on our way, we passed through a few little towns. So I wanted to share this with you just to give you a feel of how many of the towns in South Africa are very much like this, the smaller towns. Just one street through the middle and little stalls on the side and some shops. And before you know it, you're back in the countryside again. These trees on the right-hand side are called poplar trees. You know what? I'm not going to tell you much about the poplar trees. I'm going to leave that for you to go and do some research on, because they're fascinating. Look at them. They grow straight up tall. Look at the trees on the left, how differently shaped they are. And the poplar trees serve a very specific purpose, as you can imagine, one being a good wind barrier. It's like a nature's fence, or wall, more to the point. But this general scenery that you are experiencing here as you drive along with me is very much like what the scenery is most of the way to our next stop. And another thing that is very normal to us, and I've discovered it's not normal to a lot of people, and that is we do fire breaks in these parts of the world, whereby they intentionally burn big areas to control runaway fires. So it's not at all uncommon for us to see large blocks of land being burnt. We're arriving in another little town, once again, very similar sort of setting, an avenue of trees, a few shops, and don't blink because you might miss the town. We've got this little saying where we say, don't blink when we're going through a town because you might miss it. And because before you know it, you're out on the other side of the town and back into the country. So here we have another one. You'll be back in another little town. But I wanted to point out something in this particular town, because you can tell we near the Lesotho region now, the borders of Lesotho, because sandstone is a very common material that is used to build the buildings around these areas. So it's a common form of architecture. And this here is another very normal site. Lots and lots of little homes just outside town, dotted about the hills and the valleys, where people just erect their own little dwelling. I'll be showing you more of these little settlements as we travel through on our East Coast tour. And now here we are in another small town. You'll notice again the stalls on the side, the industrious people. In fact, you see those grass brooms there? Well, those are simply branches that have been, selected out of the land, and grasses that have been picked and tied on. And we have used those grass brooms for many, many years. They've been extremely useful, and they're really, really effective in doing the job well. And once again, don't blink because you'll miss the town if you do. But this is, once again, just a very typical small town in Africa. They're all very, very much like this. The only thing that's missing in this particular town is a lot of people meandering through the middle of the road, because that's usually a common sight too. But they've even taken big containers, you see that yellow one there, and used them as shops and so on. So that is how it is. And ahead of us is, once again, some of these villages that I've spoken about before, where people just build their own homes. You'll see this one that we're approaching on the left is called a rondavel. very common sight again. And very interesting how they make these rondavels. They literally put branches, lots and lots of branches, vertical and horizontal, and then pack them with mud. And then they leave the mud to dry. Of course, this is very weather dependent. It's very sad if they have torrential rain soon thereafter and all the mud just melts away. So it's quite a performance, but they do work very hard and they pack in between all the branches with mud. They wait for it to bake dry in the sun, and then they paint. Sometimes they might put plaster on to smooth it off, but other times they just paint directly onto that. And this is why you'll see all these lovely different shades of paint, different colors that they have enjoyed using to dolly up their homes. Okay, now you'll see there's the sign Maclear. We are nearly at Maclear. This is going to be our first stopover. And this experience you have now of just this winding road with the villages on either side nestled amongst the hills is pretty much how it's been from Howick until this point, other than going through the odd small town. And this entire journey that we've been on is in real time is a couple of hours long. So I hope it's given you a feel and a sense of the countryside here in KwaZulu-Natal, because this is called the East Coast road trip. We aren't at the East Coast yet, but we're on our way there, and this is what it looks like on our journey to the East Coast. And here we are, arriving at Maclear, where we're going to have a rest and continue on with our journey the following day. Of course, I have to show you a picture of the church in the centre of town. I also have to show you these passes, because this is now, from this point on, we go through a lot of passes. There's a lot of very, very beautiful passes through this part of the country. So I hope you can enjoy this part of our travel while we just wind down through these passes down to the next town. You can just take in some of the scenery with me. And then before we know it, we're at the next town. Look at that. This is actually a very good feel of the towns. Remember I was mentioning how people wander around wherever they please. And if you look ahead, you'll see that avenue of trees. That's also just very common. The main street is lined with trees as you're leaving the town. So that's not an unusual sight either. So here we are passing through yet another town, and then we will continue through a few more beautiful passes, which I will share with you. And there you see, once again, the settlement of homes that have been erected in these little clusters just outside of town. You'll be seeing more of this as we travel, but I'm just bringing it to your awareness once again. But I think what we're going to do now is go through all the passes, and I'm just going to sit back with you and hope that you can just enjoy this beautiful countryside and scenery. But just before we head into the passes, I want to tell you a little bit about these bus stops. You've seen the little villages that are built on either side of the town, all those settlements that I've shown you, the rondavels and little homes. Well, most of those people use public transport, which is basically taxis, which you've seen in the little towns that we've been through. But what I found interesting is that these bus stops have some artwork on the sides. You'll see this one that we passed and another one. And the locals come and, do their own paint and artwork on the side. I'll show you a couple more of those as we travel through. But for now, let's sit back and enjoy this countryside and these beautiful passes. As you can imagine, one has to go carefully down these passes, not just because of the windy, steep downhill, but also because of the goats. As you will notice, there were some goats that are just meandering on the side of the hill, and they can just wander across the road. And it's actually quite treacherous because sometimes it's goats or cattle or whatever, and they can just walk across the road. And so you have to be really, really careful with keeping an eye out for those kinds of unusual, unexpected things. A little warning for any visitors that want to come visit South Africa. Watch out for the goats and not just the wildlife, but the farm life as well that wanders across the roads. And here we have another bus stop, which somebody has been very creative and gone and painted on it and said, "Children ahead." I think that's wonderful that they've taken the trouble to do that. And here is another rondavel. This is a good example for you to see a larger rondavel that has a thatch roof. And look behind, there's some more rondavels with tin roofs. And actually later on, you're going to see some footage of where these rondavels are becoming less and less of a common feature in the landscape, and because they've been replaced with low-cost housing developments. And now here we are, after having passed through some passes, we arrive at Lady Freer, which is another very small town. And again, you can see the sandstone architecture, which is very unique to these parts. And the last thing we expected to see while driving through this town was a little coffee shop. You see this coffee shop, it's called Coffee on Grey, and there on the wall it says The Story. Well, I have a story to tell you about this coffee shop. Quite amazing. We actually were just about to exit the small town, and as you've already discovered, that this towns, you go through them very quickly, so it doesn't take long to drive from one end to the other. Anyway, we're about to exit this town when I said to Jamie, "I think we need to turn back." So we did so. We went back into the town, and that is when we discovered this Coffee on Grey. We went into this shop and we had ourselves a cup of coffee. But the story goes that, in fact, the people that ran this coffee shop were cousins of some very good friends of ours from where we live. Anyway, this is a very long story. I'm not going to go into all the detail of it, but it was just so fascinating that we should discover people, that there was a link, and they knew about the ministry that we ran, and they knew the people that were involved. And it was just like, how do you expect that to happen in this remote town? And you come across people that know who you are, and just incredible, really. Actually, it became quite an opportunity for us to be able to bless the needs of this particular establishment, because it went far beyond just the coffee shop. And that's why it had written on the wall on the outside the story, because this was a program actually that was helping to educate people in the town. And long story. But that's not what our East Coast tour is all about. So let me get back on the road with you and share some more of the scenery and the sights on our East Coast tour. And we headed for Graaff-Reinet. This is a pretty little town. I'm looking forward to showing you about that. But before we go very far, we encounter a stop, which is a roadblock. We had many of these roadblocks on the way down on our East Coast tour. Quite incredible. We never expected it, and they were very long, some longer than an hour. And again, we actually found this to be quite a blessing, believe it or not. I mean, I know that it could be very frustrating if you're on the clock and you needing to get somewhere by a certain time. But that wasn't the case for us. We could take our time. And so we found these stops to be quite wonderful, really, because we had an opportunity to just take a break, relax, talk, pray, look at the scenery, plan for where we were headed, how God wanted to use us in the next place that we were heading to, because where we had just come from had been quite an experience of God's hand in it all. So we were now very prepared and thinking, okay, we're going to stop here for a few hours, it looks like, so let's pray. And then when we headed back on the road again, we were faced with some fairly dark weather. You're going to see that as I show you what transpired next. Look at those clouds. The clouds started coming in thick and dark, and it literally seemed like it became dusk or even evening when it was in fact like 2:00 in the afternoon. And I just felt this was a very good opportunity for us to consider the dark times in our lives, like the stormy times whereby you can hardly bear it. The clouds descend down upon you. There's this heaviness, darkness. It's not a lovely sight. I mean, look at that now. It literally is the middle of the day here, early afternoon, and this is what it looks like. And I just wanted to share with you that there are times in our life that this does happen. We feel the darkness descending, but on the other side of that darkness is a beautiful, bright, sunshiny day. And that is actually just what's going to happen. I mean, look behind us there. There is light. So we've come from light behind us. We came out of a time of light. Then we went into a time of darkness, as in the storm ahead of us. And then the rain came, and it was really quite an experience of concern. Like you're driving more carefully. Your visibility becomes poor because the rain is so heavy. And yet you just press on, and what happens is you come out the other side into the light. So I really want to encourage you and remind you that there is light on the other side of the darkness. And then look what we saw on the other side of the storm. This magnificent church. How about that? And then we saw another church. How about that? So you might wonder why there's pink ribbon or cloth around the trunks of these trees. Well, it was Cancer Month or Cancer Week. And so this town, which we've just entered, is Graaff-Reinet, and they decided to put pink around the trunks of the trees. Here we are. We're about to arrive at the little place that we stayed at, little B&B, where we spent a couple of nights while we stayed here in Graaff-Reinet to speak to the people that were here that had invited us. We met with them at this little place called Polka, a very lovely, quaint little place in Graaff-Reinet. And we had some time with some of the families that live here in this town. And there's another thing that happened while we were in this town, and that is we discovered cold brew coffee. I'll tell you where we discovered that, here at Maria's Coffee Roastery. We now make our own cold brew coffee, and we absolutely love it. And here we have James sitting down to have a bowl of Cape Malay curry, now that we are officially in the Cape. And, of course, he must have the side dish of plain yogurt, sambles, and chilies. In fact, I did a video talking to you about how to make your own plain yogurt. You might want to watch that. We'll put a link to that for you. All right, and now here we are heading up a mountainside. Isn't that just a lovely stone path? I think it was so nicely done to blend into the surroundings. And get ready for a spectacular view. Once again, it is really hard to capture the majesty of this on film, but we did our best. But as you can also see, it's a very cloudy sky, so it wasn't the clearest of days to get the best that we could. So we continued to meander our way through these huge boulders until we arrived at this toposcope. Maybe you can do some research on toposcope. Look at that. Isn't that spectacular? There's the town nestled down in the valley, surrounded by these magnificent mountain ranges. So, so beautiful. And now look at that. God's creation. It is absolutely magnificent. When I was standing here, it reminded me of when we were in Namibia and we happened to find some canyons that we weren't really expecting. In fact, we did another video on our Namibia road trip. Something else that we are really serious and passionate about is littering. And I loved it that there wasn't litter lying everywhere in this place. In fact, there was even some bins to put your litter into. And also when there are boards that we can read with information on them so we can learn more. Also appreciate that so much. So thank you to those who take the trouble to put these things in place. It doesn't go unnoticed. Well, we really, really appreciate it. Thank you. And what would a road trip in Africa be without stopping to look at some creatures along the way? What's interesting is we come from a private nature reserve as where we live, and the animals we are used to seeing are large, zebra and buck and the like. So what was interesting on this road trip is we saw a lot of smaller wildlife. That lizard, as you saw, and look at this, a couple of tortoises rushing through the bush. If you can call that rushing, it's rushing for them, I'm sure. Here is another wonderful sight, a dam full of water. The year before we came on this road trip, there was a severe drought in this area, and it was quite a sad sight to see empty dams. I'd never seen anything like it. So this time round when we saw water, it was just very, very exciting and wonderful to know that we had had heavy rains and lots of rain and there was water. The dams were filled with water again. Something to be very grateful for. And here we are back on the road. And there we have James, our media man, helping with all this filming and footage and editing and everything else. So from this point on, you're going to start noticing a difference in the landscape and the environment. Before we were in the KwaZulu-Natal region, and now we are in the Eastern Cape region. And so it's notably different, and you'll be noticing that as we travel. And also the towns are a little different to what they were when we were coming through the more rural areas of KwaZulu-Natal. And here we are now in Aberdeen. I had never been through this town before, and something about it just completely captivated me. I was so curious about this town. First off, I noticed it was incredibly clean, so it looked like a well-kept little town. It didn't look like it was abandoned or neglected in any way. And what also really caught my attention was this church. It was magnificent. I was so fascinated by it, its architecture and just its magnificence, that I actually drove around it a few times. And Jamie was filming, and he was saying, "You've already been around this church once," because I kept on doing this big loop around and around the church. And then I couldn't leave this town. This was the only town on our entire trip that I just felt drawn to. I couldn't leave. I wanted to explore. And so instead of just driving out the other end of the town, I decided, let me look a little bit deeper. So we turned down one of the streets. And my fascination just continued to increase on this town because it was intriguing, to say the least. It was quiet, still, hardly anyone to be seen, no traffic, clean. So anyway, we continued to go around. I mean, I was just driving around this town. Jamie's comments were quite amusing, and his sound effects, like, "What are you doing, Mom?" But anyway, it was just well worth it because there was no reason for me to know at the time why I found this town so intriguing until after the fact. I did a little bit of research, and I discovered that this town was named after the place where Andrew Murray was born in Scotland, Aberdeen. Andrew Murray happens to be my all-time favorite author. I've got a bookcase full of books that he has written. So now here we see a car. Look at that. There was a car. Occasionally we see a car. Look at this lovely building. It just is so amazing. It's like Victorian architecture. And again, look at how neat and clean and well-kept everything is. I was just fascinated that I didn't seem to notice people actually living here. Everything seemed to be so quiet. But we did see this fellow in the garden tending the roses. I really enjoyed that. And we stopped and he gave us a wave and we carried on. So I realized, well, it was quite clear actually that the gardens were all well kept. So something was going on. I just didn't see any people. The other thing I didn't see was any shops, any like activity of a town. So here is Aberdeen, this little quaint town that really caught my attention, and the church most specifically. I mean, my goodness, it was really quite a spectacular church. So anybody who's watching this who happens to live in Aberdeen, I'd love to hear from you. Specifically if you're a family that are maybe home educating or whatever. I'm just really curious. I'd love to know more about this town and your life here. And just to make it extra special, look at these beautiful roses. I mean, I love roses. And here we see these amazing rose bushes, plants all over. I mean, look at that lovely little building with white roses growing in the front. And here we are back at the church again. The church dominates this little town, which again, I think is just incredible. Anyway, we were going to eventually leave after meandering around Aberdeen, and we're back on the road again, and we're making our way down to George. But we're going to pass this little town on the way, and I wanted to show you another example of how these settlements are being transformed into low-cost building developments. And there's a part of that is really wonderful in giving people a wonderful new home, stable, power, or the basic amenities. And then there's the other side whereby it's lost its uniqueness, its individuality, because we go from what you see here coming up on the left, and that is going to be gone. And what's going to replace it, slowly but surely, are these low-cost housing developments. So I just think there's a little bit of loss in that, although I'm not living here, so I'm not really in a position to speak about how wonderful it must be or feel or what the people think, because I haven't actually spoken to them about going from what was their own made little rondavels and so on into these low-cost housing development establishments. And so, continuing on the journey on our East Coast tour, road trip, we're about to head into quite a lot of passes that we're going to be going through. So I'm going to sit back and allow you to enjoy the scenery. I hope you do enjoy the scenery. Please notice the mountain sides that when you chop into the mountain like you see here to make the road. I found that fascinating. Maybe the geologists will enjoy this part. So after making our way through the passes and passing through George as well, we haven't got footage of George. It's quite a built-up city. We stopped at Wilderness and we parked our faithful little Mitsubishi. We love this vehicle. It's been so, so good to us. I wanted just to tell you a quick story about that number plate, Oikos ZN. It was such a surprise to us because we didn't order a, specific number plate like that with Oikos written on it, but the people who sold us the vehicle wanted to bless us with this special number plate. So it's always just been something when we look at the car and we look at that number plate, it's a reminder of how God just blesses us. So this place we stopped at, it's called Wilderness Dunes, or it could be known as the place of many stairs, as you are soon to discover. Up and up and up we go. I didn't actually count all the stairs. Maybe I should have, and I could tell you how many steps there actually were. But I wanted to show them to you because it was just so fascinating, all these stairs all the way up to the specific little apartment that we were staying at. And I did just want to tell you a little story while we were here, because years ago when I had cancer, whenever we booked in somewhere, we always had to check if there were steps, because the one thing that took the longest for me to heal from was being able to walk up steps and up banks and any kind of incline. So I definitely couldn't have made this in those days when I was suffering from cancer. But just look at this spot. Isn't it magnificent? Look at that. This is an area in the Eastern Cape called Wilderness. Now that I've shown you the spectacular view at Wilderness Dunes, we'll head back up the steps all the way to our apartment at the top. And so here we go, appreciating the fact that I can manage these steps, that I've got the health and strength to, and at the same time thinking of those people that perhaps can't, and just having a moment to consider them and pray for them. So I started a new thing. When I see steps, pray for somebody, pray for those that don't have the health to manage steps, and just take that moment to consider them and pray for them. I really, really believe it makes a difference to just be thoughtful of others and to consider them and pray for them when you are doing something that perhaps they can't do. So this is just us swinging around and around to give you a sense of this place, of the wilderness and all the vegetation and the many steps. Here we go. And if you look at that deck up ahead there, that is the floor of the deck where we are staying. So we go up these last flight of steps to the left. Up we go. It's a bit difficult to give you the experience of the elevation here, but perhaps you can see all these units nestled into the landscape. And after climbing those many steps, we enter the unit. Small little unit, nicely kept, nice and neat and clean, and all that we need for an overnight stay before we hit the road again. Nice, clean little bathroom with a very important skylight. Let some light in. And there we are, back on the road. And now you'll see how this vegetation has changed and how the landscape is actually quite different to what it was previously. I hope you can get a feel of that. This particular stretch, we noticed something that really delighted us, and that was these wind turbines. Just acres and acres of land of wind turbines. It was really quite encouraging to see efforts put into us harnessing power in a different way. As you can see, we have 117 kilometers to our next stop, being Port Elizabeth. So on our way there, to give you some small experience of how we were blessed by this wind turbine farm, we're just going to let this roll for a while. So as we left the wind turbines behind us, we drove through this kind of vegetation. Again, different and interesting. And here we are, arriving at Port Elizabeth on the east coast of South Africa. We do appreciate these times when we can just stop and take in our surroundings, have some time to rest. I mean, just look at this. It's so, so beautiful. Lovely ocean, and we just feel so blessed to be able to stay at such a lovely place. And we need this time not just to rest and to absorb and take in the beauty around us, but also the time that's required to do all the data wrangling and download the footage. There's our media man again. There is Jamie. He's busy taking all the footage and putting it onto the computer and putting it into a format of doing the necessary editing and so on and so forth. And my little spot there, just sitting at the table, at the dining room table with my computer, the laptop, to be able to catch up and attend to all the daily responsibilities while Jamie continues with the edit process. And then we are back on the road again, this time homeward bound, after doing our East Coast tour. In fact, some of the places we stayed at, such as Port Elizabeth, where we've just left, we did have meetings there as well. We had ministry meetings, and we have done a video series on those meetings, and they're just Q&As basically. So if you want to see those, they are there on the Oikos YouTube channel for you. But here we have our scenery on our way home, going through a town very quickly, once again. I'm sure you now become familiar with all these little towns that we whiz through, and we always take note of the church on our way. You'll see this church's steeple there ahead. Always enjoy that, being able to see the church in the town. Have opportunity once again to pray for the people in this town and just ask for God's direction and blessing upon them and His protection. There we have the church. Pretty church. Trying to see if that's sandstone or not. I don't think so. And on our journey home, we did encounter a few more roadblocks, which we didn't mind, as I've mentioned before. You know, we could get out, stretch our legs, take in our surroundings, and have time just to reflect on where we had come from, what God was wanting to do in our lives going forward, to be available to Him. So you may have gathered by now that when we encounter something that would otherwise maybe be a trial, like a storm, bad weather, lots of steps to climb, gates to open, roadblocks, we've decided to turn those otherwise difficult situations or circumstances into an opportunity for prayer, a time to pray. So that is what I'm hoping Jamie's doing while he's sitting in the car here. There he is. You might not be able to see that very clearly. I'm filming through the window of the roof of the car. There we are, back on the road, and look at that beautiful big sky and lovely big open landscape. I'm going to just let this roll now once again and hope that you can just enjoy with me these beautiful sceneries. So thank you for joining me on our East Coast road trip. I do hope you were blessed. I know we certainly were. And the purpose of sharing all this with you is to bless you. So I hope that has been achieved and accomplished.